welcome to our Doctor Who retrospective podcast. We're watching the entirety of New Who, so the post-2005 reboot, all the way through, and giving our thoughts.
As people who have already seen it.
Yes.
So we're fans of the show, we watched it all the way through, and we're going back over it to see what we think.
To see if it's as good as we remember when we were 5.
Yes. My name is Aaron, and
I'm Robert.
This is Rob, and I think a good starting point. What are your general impressions of Doctor Who before we begin this whole retrospective? What are your broad opinions?
Sure. So, I mean, obviously, you've got you can kind of break it down by showrunner and Doctor. So, obviously, under Russell T Davies, you've got Eccleston and Tennant. And I think we're both in broad agreement on that. We feel that's kind of the peak of New Who overall. Personally, then Matt Smith, I enjoy, but I think is a drop. And then I adore Capaldi. I would say Capaldi is my favourite Doctor, but in particular, Series 10 is fantastic. And then it got not good. We
will get to hot take, typical bad.
But yeah, do you want to?
Yeah, my impression is more or less the same. I think the show peaked with David Tennant. He's my favourite Doctor. I hate Matt Smith, and part of the fun of this retrospective for me will be seeing if I still hate the Matt Smith era as much as I did as a child, because I fucking loathe it at the moment. But I've never rewatched a Matt Smith episode, so like I say, that'll be interesting. I love Capaldi to bits. Matt Smith and Capaldi, even though it's still Moffat, they feel like completely different showrunners to me. And then, of course, Chibnall bad. And specifically with regard to season 1, so I started watching Doctor Who right at the end of season 2 / beginning of season 3. So season 1 for me has always been something I watched in little bits and pieces, just when I could grab a DVD or watch a repeat on BBC 3. I don't think I've ever actually watched it all the way through from start to finish, and particularly the very early episodes I've barely rewatched at all. So watching Rose for what must be like the first time in a decade for me. I know you said you watched it maybe last year.
Maybe about last year, because I did I sort of did this, but not. That's a dog.
Yeah, there is a dog in the room with us, kicking itself in the face, and that's going to happen periodically. You're going to have to live with it. The dog is called Penny, in case you're wondering.
I suspect people would. I did basically what we're doing, but not as a podcast, about a year ago, and I think I got up to series 4. So actually, nearly all of Tennant. But yeah, I hadn't watched series 1 until, because likewise, I mean, obviously I was 5 when it first aired. So yeah, I don't think, other than occasionally we watched it like when it aired, and for a long while I was like, oh, it's the boring, because I thought Tennant's great, and I was like, oh, I don't want the boring Eccleston, because I think if you watch Eccleston in just like little bits, it's less obvious how good he is.
Well, that is one of the things, my sort of memory of the Eccleston series is that, and the impression I've gotten from watching reviews is that it is a much stronger long-form narrative than most other seasons of Doctor Who, and that you do get the full experience from watching it all the way through. Later seasons of Doctor Who operate much more on, like, there are a handful of standout episodes that you rewatch a lot. And that actually brings me into my first thought about Rose, which is my impression of it when I watched it as a child was that it was really boring. And when I think back on it, it's like, well, yeah, it's got autons and it's whatever, it's fine, standard Doctor Who. But I think rewatching it now, with the context of I'm going to watch this all the way through, this is my starting point for the show, for this rewatch, it's really bloody good. Like, taken as a Doctor Who episode, it is very standard and lackluster in some senses, but as a pilot, I think it's actually brilliant. I think it's a phenomenal pilot episode.
Yeah, I mean, I think we've discussed briefly before recording that there's kind of, with this episode, there's sort of two ways of looking at it. There's the how does this operate as a pilot, as an introduction for a show that, okay, it's not a brand new show in that people had perhaps some awareness, although obviously children watching at the time probably wouldn't be familiar with Doctor Who previously. And there's also the aspect of just how is it as a piece of television, as a Doctor Who episode. And I think it succeeds strongly as a pilot, but it does also work perfectly well as just a piece of television, as a Doctor Who episode. It isn't, as you say, anything spectacular, but then in some ways, for a pilot, you almost... I mean, I was thinking this, that there is one way you could approach a pilot where you go, look, this needs to be... We're rebooting Doctor Who, this needs to be spectacular, and you could go, right, we start with the Doctor, and I would argue that, and I wouldn't be surprised if this was discussed, that the quote-unquote obvious thing to do is you have a Dalek episode. You go, look, definitely. We're going in our famous, well-known, iconic...
Well, it's interesting because Russ T Davies, in a book I've got called The Shooting Scripts for Season 1, he specifically talks about how the expectation is to do a big episode in the first... to start with, and then you cool off as it goes on. And so he said he did the opposite. He did a fairly low stakes episode with Rose, and then End of the World is the big budget. I mean, we'll have to see obviously how that stacks up when we get to it. But I was thinking with the kind of... It's quite reserved in lots of ways, and I think to its benefit, because it just means you very steadily and surely get all the relevant information. But I do wonder if you would make a pilot like this today, because there is so much, like nowadays the whole idea of you've got to grab your audience is just so pervasive, because there's so much stuff vying for your attention and people just click off so quickly. So I do actually wonder if this kind of pilot is sort of a relic of the past, in a sense.
And I think that's probably something I suspect that we'll be saying a lot, is that I always think, particularly Davies era Who is very early 2000s in both in good ways and in bad ways. It's very specific to the kind of culture of the thing, and I think that's the thing, I mean, that Davies is good at, is he captures the kind of culture in a lot of ways, but it does then mean it's very specific to the period. And I think, I mean, say Doctor Who had gone off air, a couple of years ago, say post Capaldi, and now they were going, we're going to reboot it again. You would be looking at a more... Well, I mean, one could argue that is essentially what they're doing.
Yes.
But that's another thing. I mean, and I think insofar as a pilot, it works extremely well, because from the outset, you get very clearly a sense of Davies's view of Doctor Who, his vision for it. It's you don't start with the Doctor. It's not, we're in the TARDIS, which works on two levels. It sets this much more kind of personal and grounded, if you like, tone that he goes for. Grounded in reference to Russell T Davies is maybe the wrong word, but
it's a strange fusion, because you have parts of the episode that are completely, that are grounded, like Jackie stands out as just like the most, like that's a woman who was just plucked off the street at random. There is she's a brilliant character, but there is nothing extraordinary about her as a person, and that is to the credit exactly to the credit of the writing. But then you have other things that are just utterly preposterous. Like, I feel like, again, I may eat these words as we go on, but I feel like this episode is actually cheesier than... I mean, Russell T Davies, I think he's known for being cheesy, but this feels particularly like with the arm strangling the Doctor, and they're clearly just holding a prop that isn't doing anything, and obviously the burping bin eating Mickey. Like, this is really very silly. I enjoyed it all throughout. I never found it... because it all felt very deliberate. I think that kind of tone
there's no
works.
Unintentional silliness. There's no point where you're trying to be serious and failing.
Well, it's the paradox of camp, where it's like, this is ridiculous, but we are also going to take it seriously.
Yeah.
Because like when Clive is talking about like, you know, the Doctor is dangerous, and like that's a serious conversation, and it's meant to be taken seriously, but the scene they use to illustrate this fact is Mickey being eaten by a wheelie bin.
Well, there's Mickey being eaten by a wheelie bin, and there's also the dialogue that Clive is saying is very clearly the bit in the when writing the episode. You go, okay, this is our bit where we indulge in waxing lyrical about how mysterious and dangerous the Doctor is, and also where we get to make a house call Doctor joke, and it is that thing of like, he's being really serious and being like, look, you're in danger, but the dialogue and the cutting between the bin, the bin one's interesting. I was thinking when I was watching it that obviously it's very silly, but it's also, I do wonder whether they were thinking back to, given that it's an Auton episode, and you have in the classic series, you have that bit where the guy's being eaten by a chair.
Oh yes.
And the master's just like watching this guy being, and it's very similar kind of thing. And I think that's another thing. There's this line to walk with doing a reboot of Doctor Who, where you go, we're trying to make a new thing, and that's signaled by the heavier emphasis on the companion as a person, and the sort of like general tone, but also there is that it's arguably quite a bold choice to go with the pilot, and we're going to have the Autons, which are obviously a classic alien, but are not perhaps what people would think of as Doctor Who.
I think it's a stroke of brilliance, to be honest, because I think the general understanding is that the audience at this point in time, 16 years on, are mostly going to be unfamiliar with Doctor Who, and if they are familiar, they're going to be familiar in very broad strokes.
Yes.
So the Autons to them would register as just, it's a monster of the week, plastic comes to life, sure. But to the classic fans, it reassures them this is the same continuity, we aren't throwing things out. Because there's little lines as well, like the Doctor mentions all the plastic's going to come to life like telephone wires, and there is a scene in the third Doctor story where he gets strangled by it. That's not invasive. I was wondering if there was going to be a line where he mentions I've met them before, but it doesn't even go that far. It's just, if you care about that, then the details are there, but they don't get in the way of the newcomer.
There is no scene of Doctor turns to camera, I've seen them before, they're super dangerous. That's all just communicated through the episode and through what happens. And the introduction of the key elements of, obviously, the sonic screwdriver, the Doctor himself, and the TARDIS, and all these things, again, are done in this way that would not be intrusive to a viewer who is already familiar with Doctor Who. There's no point where you'd be like, I know what the TARDIS is, I don't need, because it's very contained, but it is also done in this way that leads you through if you are a new viewer. It's another thing where having it very focused on the companion works. You meet the Doctor in the way that the companion meets the Doctor. He's a mysterious character.
So even if you already know these elements, it still works narratively because the character isn't familiar with them. And you know that works like that because Davies does the same thing when he introduces Martha and Donna. And even though it's the same bit of like, what's that? Oh, it's bigger on the inside. It still works because it's characterful.
Yeah, and it would be frankly bizarre if they went in and were just like, oh, okay, yeah. That makes sense.
Exactly.
That scans. And on the kind of characterization point, the characterization is both subtle and utterly brilliant.
I'm not exaggerating when I say I had a better impression of who Rose and Mickey were before in the little montage at the beginning, when Rose is going about her day. I got a clearer sense of their characters than I have, I don't know what, than Yaz or Ryan. Maybe not quite Graham, but I got at least as good an impression of Rose and Mickey in a minute where they didn't speak as I did with Graham over 2 seasons. Even just the bit where Mickey leans in for a kiss and Rose kind of pulls away and then sort of laughs it off. It's like she's not that into him.
Not as committed, and he's more into her than she is. And that is not just a throwaway. So I was thinking this a couple of times in the very excellent 5-hour video essay,
The Fall of Doctor
Who.
Shout out to JXC if you're watching this, I love you, man.
And the a point that they make in that is when you get characterization and you learn something about a character, when the character later does something, you should eventually be able to look back and go, oh, I understand why they did that. And I was thinking this, in terms of, as you say, the relationship that Mickey and Rose has, that he's obviously more into her than she is him, that obviously that comes back later, and there's a lot of growth in Mickey's arc in terms of going, actually, I gotta give up on Rose at some point. And also, obviously, her willingness to leave at the end doesn't feel like completely out of the blue, because it's very clear she's not that satisfied with her day-to-day life. But also, I was thinking there's the characterization of Rose as somebody who can get kind of swept up in the action and kind of go, because I was thinking, so you have where she's going like, well, is Mickey dead? And she's worried about, Mickey being dead. But then once there's kind of this thrill of like, oh, I found the dish, and goes off and running, grabs the Doctor's hand, goes and running. And so then later on, very, very later on, well, I suppose in the first instance, in the finale of this season, she gets kind of carried away in terms of taking, obviously absorbing the time vortex and all the rest of it. And then later on in Doomsday, ultimately her undoing is kind of getting swept up in being, with the Doctor and all the rest of it. And so none of those things later on, you go, well, hold on, what's happened there? It's
the very delicate balance between this Rose is not the same Rose in Doomsday or even Parting of the Ways, but you can absolutely see how she gets from one state to the other. The core characterization is present from the outset. It just grows and sort of evolves. And
those particular character traits are brought out more,
because like the love of adventure becomes almost all-consuming in season 2. That's largely the point of season 2, but of course, again, we will get to that.
And also with the Doctor, you get a sense of like why he is offering to have Rose travel with him. Like there are points in the episode where you can both credit to the writing and credit to Eccleston's performance, that you can see him kind of like looking at her and being like, there's something here that is a bit different, and isn't just like Rose isn't just like confident and brilliant in every situation, as perhaps some later companions are. In the outset,
she's very realistically capable. I think like the bit that stands out to me is early on when she guesses that the Autons are students.
Yes.
The guess is completely wrong, but the Doctor respects
I
the
can
thinking.
See, based on what you know,
exactly.
You're making reasonable.
You're working with the information you have, and you're coming up with a good, sensible conclusion. It's wrong, but you're thinking.
Yeah.
And that actually brings on to just for a touch more Chibnall bashing, if you'll indulge me. If you contrast her with Yasmin Khan, who in her pilot episode utters the phrase, I am capable of more than parking disputes, she has essentially the same alleged arc as Rose does, of like, I want, and she again says in Arachid UK, I want more of the universe. It's beating you over the head with it, but never showing you it. In this story, I got the complete sense, you get the sense of mundanity from the montage at the beginning, which is almost wordless, and then through Rose's interactions with the Doctor and how she keeps up with him and how she's intrigued by him, you get the sense that she is far more interested in this than she is in going back to work and getting a job, which again you contrast with Mickey, who's just trying to get away from this as fast as he can. At no point does she say I want more from my life, but I completely get that's
very
clear,
and it's each person has a clear characterization. Jackie works, you instantly, like you say, instantly you understand what kind of person she is, and even how they play off one another, where Jackie's going, well, you need to look for compensation because you need money, you need to get another job because I'm not paying for you, and Rose is very reticent about like, I don't want to work in a butcher shop, I don't want to you just get through the dialogue and like you say, not even in the dialogue, in the montages and everything, it's just very clear that Rose has a very different outlook on life than
like Jackie is totally resigned to her sort of state as a totally ordinary person, where Rose is not quite happy with that.
But I think crucially with Jackie, and it comes out I think a bit in this episode, but obviously more so as she's developed as a character, is that she's resigned to her life not really improving, but she's not totally resigned in the way that she doesn't, because she's like, oh, we could get a bit of compensation. There are things, that she's like, and that is very much Jackie's character of like, she's feisty and she fights things and she doesn't just take everything lying down, but equally there is this kind of underlying resignation of, I'm basically not going to do any better than this.
I think possibly instead of resign, maybe the phrase is she's happy with her life. Because I don't get the sense that Jackie, we're getting a little ahead of ourselves, but I don't get the sense that she's an unhappy character all in all.
Not all in all.
Yeah, I think she is, or has made peace with, might be a better way of phrasing it. She's made peace with the idea that this is all her life will amount to, whereas Rose is still resisting that idea.
I think in some senses you could make an argument that Jackie is kind of Rose if Rose didn't meet the Doctor.
Yes, definitely.
That she kind of serves that arc, and it's also, I think that's quite good because it's not going like, oh, you're a bad person if you haven't met the Doctor or done all these amazing things. It's an opportunity that Rose has and then is able to take and improve as a person, but there's no sort of condemnation of even really Mickey isn't, he's obviously not presented as like, this is how you should behave, but I don't really feel like there's kind of a, he's ultimately a bad person, and obviously he develops and improves and becomes much more useful and less pathetic, but
definitely. Although not really so much in season. Oh, actually, no. I think he does. Yeah, that's much more in season 2. There's a little bit of development in season 1.
But but I mean that again, not to get too far ahead, but that makes sense because he comes from such a sort of useless position that it would be quite a fast character development to be like, at the end of season 1 he's where he is at the end of season 2. That would be kind of honestly, but to kind of get back on Rose specifically, one thing I noted, and it's not really that big of a point, is there's no pre-title sequence.
There isn't. No, that threw me.
Yes, I very nearly, when we were watching it, I very nearly was like, have you skipped? I nearly said so because I'd forgotten that. And it makes sense because what would you have as the pre? I mean, I suppose you could have a cliffhanger and to draw people in, but you sort of think it would be the act of an extremely inattentive viewer to turn off.
And I do also think actually that title sequence being first, possibly, I think it's done for 2 reasons. I think firstly because it's hard to do a cold open when you haven't established any kind of base reality for the world at this point. Exactly. But secondly, I think my understanding is that the Doctor Who opening titles are fairly iconic, like even among non-Doctor Who fans. Hold on, the dog is muttering. I'm going to wake her up before she becomes loud. Penny. 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 There we go. I apologise. You returned to your regularly scheduled programming. So where was I? So starting with the opening title sequence, something that is very recognisably the Doctor Who opening titles, but also very modernised. I think that again is a clear kind of mission statement. And also, a thing I noticed this time is that when you have the little montage with Rose, it's very characterful, but because it's not overt and in your face, a lot of it's registering subconsciously. And then when Rose goes up to, like, you know, the sort of dark parts of the building, and she's like, oh, Wilson, Wilson, and then the door closes behind her and the stuff. I reckon the intention there is to portray her as the kind of, you know, the dumb blonde who gets killed at the beginning. Because she is kind of, part of her character arc is that she is a sort of just a person who grows into something extraordinary. So I think the very subtle characterization at the beginning tells you a lot, but it's not so obvious that you would then think, well, this character will clearly survive. In fact, I watch a lot of reaction channels. I think quite a lot of reactors kind of mark her for death when they're watching it. They're just like, oh, this girl's clearly going to die. And I think that's important. I think that's why, because that scene would normally be the cold open is normally the person being killed. So I think you couldn't do that.
It's an interesting point that you raise about the reaction, like modern people reacting to it who presumably aren't broadly familiar with Doctor Who and haven't seen the episode before. That obviously, I think if you were watching it at the time, you probably would be aware that Rose isn't going to die because of the publicity of the Billie Piper being in the role. Equally, as a child, you maybe haven't seen loads of the publicity. I don't recall. As I recall, I mean, like I said, I didn't watch Doctor Who right from that first series. Series 2 is primarily where I started watching it regularly. But as I recall, the reason that we as a family started watching Doctor Who was primarily due to my dad being like, oh, it's Doctor Who, you know, it's a reboot of Doctor Who, because obviously he was familiar with it from the classic series. So as a child, I don't think I probably saw a lot of the publicity. So conceivably, you might have thought that Rose was going to die.
I can say for a fact, when I was a child, I wasn't aware of publicity or announcements or any sort of thing like that. And I certainly had no idea that Billie Piper was famous outside of Doctor Who, particularly because my understanding is that her fame in Doctor Who then eclipsed her pop star fame very quickly.
Easily.
So yeah, by the time I was watching it, I would have had. I think that's part of that's one of the issues with this. We can't really review it quite how it would have been viewed at the time because we just weren't there to a large degree.
We weren't watching it there. We were 5 or whatever. I
think we'd have been 4 actually, because this or I'd have been 4 at least, because my birthday's middle of early July, and Doctor Who would always air in like the spring when Russell Davies was in charge, so I would have been 4 years old.
Yeah, so I mean, like I said, I didn't really watch the first series very much, and then the second series really picked up watching it regularly. In terms of, so we've said, I think broadly, a lot of very positive stuff about the episode. What, if anything, would you critique?
So I wasn't going to critique this when we went into it, but the special effects, I wasn't going to critique it because I knew they weren't going to be very good, and broadly speaking, I don't mind bad special effects, particularly in something like this. I think it's very...
in service of a good story.
Exactly. I think it's very tone dependent. If you're telling a very gritty, realistic story and it has bad effects, that's a problem. But if you're telling a cheesy, silly kind of, we're here to have fun kind of story, I don't mind dodgy special effects, as long as I can clearly see what it's meant to be. But some of the stuff in this is genuinely like the bin when Mickey's trying to pull his hands from it is it's just bizarre. It's confusing. It's like, why does it look like that? Why is he twisting so awkwardly? And the lightning bolt when the nesting consciousness starts transmitting is literally classic Who level special effects.
There were a few, broadly, I thought, there were a few scenes where I sort of thought, this is actually more on the grounds for the time of Doctor Who flexing its muscles a little bit, of saying, look, we're not the small budget classic, wrinkly tinfoil show, but then contrasted with those few scenes where you did think, some of the, particularly the sort of CG stuff, like the sort of actual like 3D, like the bin and like the nesting consciousness itself, reminded me a bit of, and I think it was the title sequence for Sylvester McCoy's run, where it was just about when they started having computer graphics
and
instead of
it's got like
practical.
CG meteors.
Yeah, and they're like, oh well, let's do the title sequence with like a 3D TARDIS and things like that, and it just doesn't look as good. Especially watching it back now, it doesn't stand up as well as the previous practically done things. Now, obviously, and indeed even with this episode, the 2005 title sequence is obviously computer generated and looks great. But it still hadn't quite got there, I think, for the budget that they were on, and that at the time it was not something. It was maybe a bit too far to think that you could do a convincing CG bin and the CG nesting consciousness. Equally, I don't know what you would do other than that.
I'm going to defend the nesting consciousness. I was fine with that solely because I have no frame of reference for what a pile of living plastic is meant to look like. Like, I can tell that that's a computer-generated effect, obviously, but it was like, I don't know that this isn't looking like what it's meant to. Whereas the bin,
you know what a bin looks
growing
like.
And shrinking weirdly is
particularly because you have literally just seen the bin and then it becomes CG, and it's sort of a bit jarring. The thing with the nesting consciousness, I think it's fine, it's perfectly serviceable. The bit that I think looks strange is when he throws the anti-plastic in, or rather Rose throws the anti-plastic in, and it sort of does this strange... It reminds me a little bit of in Lord of the Rings when the ring goes in Mount Doom, and it's sort of this sitting bit, and then it sort of just phases through it almost. And obviously the fluid simulation is extremely difficult even now in CG, certainly on a television budget, but the anti-plastic kind of spilling out just sort of looks like this gel almost, which again, I suppose, what does anti-plastic look like? But I've always, whenever I see that thing, I think that looks a bit off. But it's not, that's nitpicking. It's not plot relevant. It's not, and that's, I think, always been the thing with, even when I watch Classic Who, I don't really mind the dodgy special effects if the story's good. I mean, I think a good example of that is like Genesis of the Daleks, which is obviously, certainly I'd argue, is a fantastic serial. The Daleks in that are a bit wobbly. And it's like, sure, maybe it detracts from it a bit in that they're supposed to be these incredible killing machines, and the most powerful thing, and they wobble, but equally, you can rationalize it on like, oh, they're prototypes or whatever, but equally it doesn't detract from it because the plot is good. And in the same way, with this, it is nitpicky to be like, oh, the anti-plastic doesn't look like real anti-plastic.
Genesis of the Daleks, for me, I don't think the special effects do work, and for two reasons. Firstly, they are so bad, but like I can never take any Dalek story where the Daleks have painted eye stalks seriously, especially when you compare them to the I don't know what it's called, but the growing and shrinking eyes they had in their first series. That look fantastic.
Yeah, they have a kind of aperture to
exactly.
them.
They're so good. So the painted eye stalks really take a lot out of it for me. And also, Genesis of the Daleks is a very serious story and tone, which, like I was saying earlier, I think that demands more realistic effects. Whereas this, a good example with this is that towards the end, when the nesting consciousness building is just exploding for no reason, like the explosions do not look good, but they don't have to, because it's like you're watching it, it's like, well, this building's exploding for no reason, so the show clearly isn't trying to draw me in and make me really care about the cause and effect.
It's like we need an explosion.
Exactly, it's clearly here to have fun, so I'm going to be much more forgiving of the lesser quality special effects in that instance.
So that kind of raises an interesting, or a thing relevant, like in terms of what I would critique about the episode. I think it is much stronger in all the bits leading up to the nesting consciousness. After the nesting consciousness shows, like, when they're actually in, talking to it, I think they struggle to make, and maybe this is a little bit the effects thing, a little bit the sort of budget. I think they struggle to make the Autons themselves that scary when they're all coming out. I think they do a very good job in the shot with just Rose, because they are working on this. It's dark and slow movement, and it's more sort of slow horror almost. When they're just out in the open and sort of waving their arms around, it's a bit kind of like, okay, what are they actually doing? Having said that, shooting Clive is, I think, kind of excellent in that it sets up like we will kill off characters, if which obviously Davies does do. You're just going like, yeah, you like this character, I'm going to kill them. And the way that shot is shot is very like, obviously we can't show a guy getting shot on our primetime kids sci-fi show, but just the cut to the Orton firing and just kind of silence is quite impactful, in that you don't show Clive, because obviously they could have done like Clive clutching his chest and sort of falling over, and that would have undercut the moment. And it's also excellent that it's when he's having his big I was right and you sort of expect, almost conventionally, to be like, well, now he gets his reward for being correct and right all along, and then he sort of realizes he's just going to get shot.
See, that again, it's interesting you make that point, because I, as a sort of Doctor Who fan, very well versed in Doctor Who, like, there's no, the minute that the Autumn started moving and he was in the shopping centre, I'm like, well, this guy's dead. But it's interesting, if someone approaching it for the first time might not necessarily guess that. It's quite an interesting point to make, and that it reminds me of one reactor I was watching when she saw this episode. Sort of asked, like, are the stakes going to be this high in every story? Because, like, the world is under attack. And I was just like, this is like, I don't even register this as really a conflict. Like, the Autons taking over the world is a complete non-issue as far as, like, I'm concerned. It's such a foregone conclusion that this will be dealt with. Which is not to the episode's detriment, I don't think.
The episode's not really about the Autons.
Exactly, and it very wisely doesn't spend too much time on that. It doesn't try to convince you it's important.
And I mean, that's where, like you were saying earlier, that where it might be tempting to go, well, it's the pilot, we need to have the Daleks or the Cybermen or both or whatever, that it recognises, the writers recognise that what we're trying to do here is introduce the Doctor, we're trying to introduce Rose, we're trying to introduce the basic concepts of the show, both to people who are familiar with them maybe, but a lot of people who aren't familiar with the sort of structure of the show. And it would be frankly confusing and too much to be like, look, you need to focus on the Doctor and Rose and also on the plan of the alien and the thing. And it's just like a monster of the week sort of situation. Makes a lot more sense for that, because you can just kind of put it in the background and be like, look, this is the baseline of the story and this is sort of what you can expect structurally, but it's not what we want you to focus on. It's not the important thing.
Yeah, exactly. And sort of talking of the villains, that does touch on another small criticism I had, which is when the Doctor is talking to the nesting consciousness, he's obviously very quickly establishing the motivations, and it's obviously touching on the Time War there. And I don't think it really works, because he's talking about it in such broad terms and mentioning, like, and because you can't understand the nesting consciousness, it's so fractured. And then him being like, I fought in the war, I couldn't save everyone. It feels, to me as a viewer, it feels like a clunky sort of, Time War reference. But also as a new viewer, I don't think it's clear enough what the actual point of the conversation is for you to even pick up on that as an important detail. Do you know what I mean? Like, it's not dwelled on enough for it to stick in someone's memory and sort of reinforce this idea of, the Doctor fought in a war, there was a big battle, and to me, knowing what he's talking about, it's a very lackluster reference.
See, it's interesting, because I think I almost thought the opposite, in that I thought it was quite a good sort of, look, there's something more going on. And actually, in some senses, the fact that the nesting consciousness doesn't actually sort of speak in English or whatever almost works in its favour in that it doesn't require great exposition about what the Time War is, in a way where, because you just kind of vaguely imagine what the Nestene consciousness is saying, in that it's clear that the Nestene consciousness home planet's destroyed, and that they feel that the Doctor had some hand in that, through recognising the TARDIS, etc. And whereas if you were trying to write that dialogue, it's like, how do you do that? Arguably in a way, like you say, that wouldn't be clunky. And I feel like almost by not having that and just kind of inserting it, it's like it's maybe too much to say it's setting things up, because it is very
well. That's it. It kind of almost needs to be clunkier. I commend Russell T Davies for not being overly clunky, because obviously he's excellent with his dialogue, and I don't think that's necessarily an exception. But it's kind of it's so natural and so non-expository, and it's referencing something that at this point in the show is so completely like no one has any clue what the Time War is, be they old fans or new fans. So I just kind of feel like it isn't actually doing its job, and you could probably, this is a nitpick beyond
it's absolutely
words,
a nitpick,
but I just feel like it could have gone. To me, it felt like he was going, I should probably set this up now because it's going to be important later on, but not really doing it in a way that would particularly help a viewer.
But I do wonder whether it's something where it doesn't serve a functional purpose, in terms of exposition, but it sort of gives it is very much just a sort of gentle hint of there is something a bit bigger going on than just this bloke going around in his box. Particularly for a new viewer, again, it's not going to be by itself something that's going to be like, there's some interesting story going on here. But I think it's like those little things, like the mention of the Shadow Proclamation, for instance. It doesn't mean anything, at this stage in the show. It's like, okay, cool, and equally, and then also I have no idea to what extent at some point the Shadow Proclamation goes from, hey, it's a fun sort of abstract thing we can reference, to, it's a national organisation we're going to interact with at points. But I do kind of like those just little sort of sprinklings of references that aren't explicit references, because the way that people generally talk isn't to kind of go, hey, do you remember that time we were in, it's just slipped in the conversation.
Hey, do you remember the Time War that destroyed millions of races?
Gee, wasn't that hard? I have battle scars now.
I think you make a good point. It's possibly because the Shadow Proclamation line didn't bother me, but that's because the Shadow Proclamation kind of remains a fairly throwaway world-building detail, whereas the Time War becomes a major plot point. Central. So I may just be kind of trying to get into the writer's head with that bit and being like, sort of assuming
what's the function?
Assuming that Russell T Davies is planning something grander with it. But you may be right, he may just be doing a small world building detail that you're not actually meant to pick up on until later,
because I think that's something Davies is very good at. I know, like, we've said this countless times, of like, the Davies era is an era of Doctor Who where there is this sense of there is a world beyond the Doctor. There's a world beyond what we're seeing on the show. There is a sort of whole universe going on, which is obviously ultimately aided by the existence of Torchwood and Sarah Jane Adventures. But even absent those, I think even in this first episode, you kind of get a sense of, obviously the Doctor's important. He's obviously a powerful figure. I mean, you have the whole, I can feel the world turning and all the rest of it. He's obviously somebody of note, but he's not a sort of... He's not a god, which obviously is something that changes.
That does change within the Davies era.
It does change.
I remind you of the very subtle Jesus symbolism at the end of Last of the Time Lords.
Yeah,
the doctor levitates in glowing light while the whole world chants his name. That
does change, but it does sort of. It does change. I'm not even gonna. I was gonna try and sort of be like, but it works more. No, like
I do agree it works better in the Davies era, but he undeniably becomes messianic before Moffat.
And I've always sort of felt that the Doctor really ought to, be somebody who knows a lot of things. He ought to be, a well-versed traveller who, I think Fourth Doctor encapsulates that very well, and actually Capaldi. But anyway, that's I'm
only going to say this because I'm thinking of it, and then because we're getting very ahead of ourselves. I do think the difference between when Moffat does the Messianic Doctor and Davies does it is that usually with Davies, it is other people revering the Doctor. In that moment, the Doctor has, like with Last of the Time Lords, the Doctor's just concocted a plan to defeat the Master that sort of happens to involve the whole world revering him, and then he's very grateful that they forget him by the end. Whereas in the Moffat era, he will often be like, I am the Doctor, I am the man who has lived 2,000 years, and I'm the Doctor, look me up, fear me, I've killed all the Time Lords, let someone else try first, all of that stuff.
And I sometimes I am always sort of drawn back and forth on those moments of like, there's a part of me, there's the young Doctor Who fan in me who's like, yeah, it's the Doctor. But then there's the part of me that's like, from a sort of plot and story side, I'm like, yeah, okay.
But that's why I think it works when it's other people revering the Doctor,
because it makes sense.
Because it's like an audience standard in a sense. It's like, we view him as this great figure, but he will only ever view himself as a lonely traveller, and I think Moffat kind of grabs the wrong end of the stick with that idea.
Anyway,
back to Rose, where none of that is relevant.
The episode that we're definitely discussing.
I do actually, with the Turn of the Earth speech that you mentioned. I actually, that's another small criticism I have, just because, again, I'm sort of thinking from the writer's perspective. I think Davies is trying to set up, how do I explain this? So far in the episode, the Doctor has been portrayed as a very carefree kind of, like he says, it's like, I'm just wandering through, I'm buzzing off now. That's not the phrase he uses, but I can't remember it exactly. And I feel like that was it, S1E1. And I feel like Davies is thinking, but no, he's not just this. He also has this depth to him. So I need to set that up now. And I think the speech itself is a little bit clunky. I think there's a lot of melodramatic moments in this episode that do work. I don't think that's one of them. And I think there are plenty of moments throughout the season that will plenty establish the Doctor has, a grandiosity and a sort of, this kind of pain in him and all of that kind of stuff, and I don't think we needed it this early on, and I don't think it really comes across properly.
I mean, I guess it's the challenge of a pilot of going, what needs set up from the offset, and what can we trust that people will keep watching and we have time to set up later. And I think I sort of agree. When I was watching that, it's in this sort of grey area where it's dramatic, sort of melodramatic enough that it's like, this isn't just a sort of throwaway, and he's he's not just this sort of traveller, but it's not quite dramatic enough where I'm like, but I really like it as a speech though. Like it's fine, but it's not like, it's not the Zygon inversion speech. No. Which, even if you wanted to critique that speech within the context of the episode or whatever, by the by, it's still a really solid speech by itself in a way that this perhaps isn't so much. I still like it, but I did think it was strange on the rewatch that he sort of hypes himself up to Rose essentially, and then goes, "Now forget me." And it's like, it sort of is nice from a verbal poetry standpoint of like, with this, and then the sort of sudden contrast of "now forget me." that works. But in thinking in terms of the plot and also his character motivations, if he wants Rose to forget him, why is he being like, oh, you should really care about me, I'm super important?
Yeah, I think part of why that doesn't work is it feels very much for the audience.
Yeah.
Whereas a lot of this episode does not.
I know, absolutely.
Yeah, Davies is... I've said this sort of to you before. He is so good at writing stories that feel natural. Like, even in his less good stories, somehow they feel like this is just the only way the story can be told. This is just what happened.
Yes.
And
you're just getting a little window into something.
Exactly. And this episode has that exact same quality as well. Bar that one moment. Like, I was thinking throughout, just like the pace of it, the way it, like, it's so, and maybe this is the curse of lowered expectations after, you know, the Chibnall era, but it's so clear what is happening, what the point is, who the characters are, what they're trying to do, and what we're supposed to be feeling, and it all comes across. And the pace, like with Chibnall episodes, I'm fighting to retain my interest and to sort of, because there's so much over exposition in those episodes, and I'm constantly having to go just that, okay, no, we can push that down, we can focus on the good stuff. And with this, I was just relaxing into it and easing into the story, and it was carrying me away. And it's like, I mean, Russell T Davies is very good at that, but I think there is definitely, and so he deserves praise for that, but I think there's also definitely a quality that the reason I'm so amazed and enjoying it so much is because I have to fight to enjoy Doctor Who nowadays.
I think also there's a difference, because like I say, I mean, I watched this maybe a year ago, give or take, the last time, and I sort of said I enjoyed it more this time watching it, I think, than the last time I watched it. And I do wonder whether part of that is because I was obviously watching it with the thing of like, well, I've got to now talk about this, which, I mean, obviously, you know, we talk about Doctor Who. If we recorded every time we talked about Doctor Who, we would have series and series of podcasts. But you know, like, it's a different thing watching it and being like, I am going to have something to say about this, and so you're sort of watching it in this way of like, okay, what is working here, what isn't working here,
and so much is, but it's not obvious, it's not in your face,
and it's very, so when you're thinking about it like that, you're like, oh, there's a thing there and there's a thing there. I mean, I think the big standout things are the characterization, again done in this for, I mean, as much as you say, compared to the current state of things, that there is a comparative thing there, but equally just on its own merit, none of the characters are interchangeable. This is something that I think is, you know, a very, very basic but a useful kind of litmus test for characterization is, could you swap, you know, two characters in it, and would it affect the story?
Well, could you swap the dialogue around and it still makes sense? And you absolutely
could not. There's nothing that Rose says that you would be like, oh, Mickey could say that, or Jackie could say that.
But even Jackie, who is Rose's mum, it's like you couldn't swap their dialogue around. No. It would just sound jarring.
And actually, that sort of reminded me, I think, because equally you couldn't do that with Rose and the Doctor, and that is something that I think is really crucial, because what Davies managed to do with Rose is create a companion that is not, because there are classic companions who, by which I mean companions of the classic era, not necessarily classic companions, that you wouldn't be able to change their dialogue with the Doctor, but that's largely because they've been made so useless and so damsel in distress that obviously the big hero isn't going to say those things. What they managed to do with Rose is create a companion character who is distinct from the Doctor, but is distinct from the Doctor in that she has her own particular set of skills and capabilities and drives that are different from the Doctor, and they complement one another. In some sense, as a lot of companions do, there's the kind of complement of the Doctor sometimes forgetting about the human element and the companion having to remind him of that. But even just in terms of the observation thing, like the Doctor misses this big dish because he's looking for some alien, or or thinking technologically.
He's kind of too clever in a way. He needs someone ordinary to just go.
Obviously, it's the London Eye.
Is it the big circle?
Because he's thinking, well, they must have hidden it. It must be invisible. He says that in the episode, that it must be completely invisible, because he's thinking they must have some high tech thing rather than just hiding in plain sight. In London. And so it's things like that where you're like, he needs Rose, not because he's weak as a character or she's weak as a character. They're both strong,
their
but
strengths complement each other.
And again, that plays into, you can understand why he wants her to come with him, even if he's not, as he wouldn't probably be consciously sort of tallying up, being like, I have these strengths and she has. There's a sense that he connects with her and feels like there is a complementary relationship there.
So you see the relationship grow over the course of the episode, from the way he treats her at the beginning, sort of cracking jokes, because he's thinking, there's this poor bystander, caught up in the middle of this, I could have a little bit of fun with her, sort of be like, don't tell anyone about the story, get them killed, bye-bye. And then as it goes on, it's clear she's sticking around, he then sort of toughens and he's like, don't go away. And then when it's clear that she's really sticking around, she really cares, he's like, okay, actually, you've got quite a bit to offer. You know what? You're cut out for this.
And that,
proving yourself.
And that builds through the episode in, like you say, the comment about the students, where she's thinking logically through, with the information she has, to be like, oh, the Ortons must be students. The Doctor, that's the first moment where he's sort of like, there's that you're right, that's not a completely stupid thing to say.
But it's also, that's nowhere near enough for him to be like, you should just travel.
He's not like, you've made a basic deduction that shows some ability to kind of think. He's not like, yes, that is all the qualification you need, but it gets his attention, and so then he's is sort of primed to look a bit more. There's no massive jump. The place he is at the start of the episode, the place he is at the end of the episode, are very different places, but there's no single point where it's a sudden jump.
Which is the mark of brilliant character development. That you can't point to any single instance and be like, this is when they changed. That's not a rule. I can think of some characters that do have a big shift. But
if there's a big event,
but as a general rule, particularly in long form storytelling, like it should be natural, and this really is. And I do the thing, you made a point slightly earlier, I think we kind of moved on from it, but I want to jump back a bit, when you're talking about the Doctor needing Rose and stuff like that. It occurred to me watching this episode how many core themes of the Davies era are set up here. Like when Clive talks about the Doctor's constant companion is death, that idea, both in terms of people dying around the Doctor and the Doctor's sort of relationship with that, this idea of death, it is constant, and the consequences of that are explored in so many different ways. You've got Waters of Mars, where he's trying to sort of fight back against it. You've got Human Nature, where I can't remember her name, but the nurse character chastises him and berates him for letting so many people die.
And crucially is right.
Yes, and it's all right there from episode 1, and also the idea that again comes to a climax, straight enough, again in Waters of Mars. Maybe that's why that episode is so great. I guess we'll realise when we get there. But the idea of the Doctor needing someone to humanise him, Christopher Eccleston, I was quite surprised here. He's so brilliant in this. It completely it caught me off guard almost. He totally embodies the character.
Eccleston always catches me off guard how good he is.
Yeah, but crucially he's charming and he's charismatic, but he captures the alienness and the detachment. And there's quite a lot of that in this episode, like when he forgot about Mickey and he's quite rude and nasty almost. And that's not who he is by the end of the season, and certainly obviously when he regenerates into 10 and that whole storyline. So again, you can see the germ of this right here. The Doctor here is very alien, and he will, through his relationship with Rose, morph into a much more human character. And that
ultimately, literally.
And that theme of needing the companion to keep him grounded and humanise him, it's there throughout the whole series, and they do so much with it. And and I think that's why this episode it's not one to just sort of be like, oh, I fancy watching some Doctor Who, I'm going to pop on and rewatch Rose. But when you view it in the context of this is the pilot episode to kick off the show, particularly the Davies era, I think it's really phenomenal. I was very impressed by this.
Again, going back to that idea of characterization as being, you should be able to look back when you learn more about the character and understand why they did the thing that they did. That's absolutely the case, I think, with all the characters, but crucially, mainly the Doctor and Rose, that there are the seeds of their later character development and things like that, ultimately come together later in the series. That it doesn't feel like, oh, it's a good episode, but then it goes in a completely different direction. The rest of the series follows very naturally on it. On that note,
I feel like I've said everything I have to say. I think a fantastic episode, fantastic pilot more than anything else.
Yeah, so I guess that's broadly seems to be both our takes on it. Is fantastic pilot, very solid episode. Even just forgetting the pilot aspect, very, very solid start to a reboot of Doctor Who. It may perhaps be more interesting in following episodes if we end up disagreeing on, because I think we maybe disagreed on one point slightly throughout this whole thing, but we'll see.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward for when we get to Day of the Doctor. I won't spoil which one of us has which opinion, but we have very differing views on that.
Yes, indeed. And with that, we shall say goodbye for this episode and see you next time.